The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a debate between Matt Dillahunty and Jon Morrison on the topic, Does Science Move Us Toward or Away from God? This debate took place in Red Deer, Alberta, Canada on October 17, 2015. It was sponsored jointly by Alberta Secular Conference, the Society of Edmonton Atheists, and Living Stones Church. Jon Morrison is the teaching pastor at Maple Ridge Baptist Church in Maple Ridge, British Columbia. Jon holds a master's in Christian apologetics from Biola University. He has also studied at Oxford University before working for a nonprofit organization called Apologetics Canada. In 2013, Jon published Clear Minds and Dirty Feet, a book aimed at translating the evidence for Christianity for both skeptics and Christians alike. Jon also teaches spiritual formation at Pacific Life Bible College in Surrey, British Columbia. He is married to Haley, and they have a daughter named Abigail.
Well, hello everybody. Good evening. It's good to see you. I want to say thanks to Karen for helping me get set up here and for hosting this event.
Sorry, watch your toes.
Oh, no problem.
This problem earlier.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
That's better.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Living Stones, for paying for the plane ride over here. Thanks, Matt, for showing up. I know we haven't been very good with Canadian hospitality because his luggage hasn't shown up, and I'm sure he'll talk about that. But welcome to Canada. We're so glad you're here, and I'm excited to share a podium with you. It'll be an honor to be a part of tonight. It's an interesting discussion to think that we are talking about, does science point us towards God? This seems like one of the age-old discussions, a discussion that's been going on since the days of Nacho Libre. I don't know if you're familiar with the movie with Jack Black, but in it he has a wrestling partner by the name of Esqueleto. And Esqueleto hasn't been baptized, and this concerns Jack Black as they're going up against a group called Satan's Cavemen. And in a funny little exchange, they have Jack Black basically says to him, I'm a little concerned about your salvation and stuff. And he goes, why are you always giving me a hard time just because I believe in science? And so basically he goes back and grabs the bowl, and just for precautionary measures, he baptizes his wrestling buddy to make sure that God is on their side in the big match. So my friends are asking me tonight, hey, you're going to Red Deer for a debate. How would you know if you win the debate? And I said, well, I don't really know if if we're going to have that win or lose situation. I think it's going to be more of a discussion, a conversation between Matt and I. But I did think, maybe we would have a chance to say at any time, Matt, I have a bowl here, just like from the movie. And so I said to Matt that at the end of this, at the end of our debate, if he chooses to be baptized, we could call that a win. I'm not necessarily counting on it, but it could be an option. But anyways, I hope that I don't have to choose as a pastor between God and science, because I personally want to go on record by saying that I really appreciate science. I appreciate science because it flew me here over the Rocky Mountains. We didn't have to walk through the Rockies to get here. I appreciate that it amplifies my voice so that I don't have to shout at you guys all the way to the back. I appreciate that it gives me my phone, that I can, make a call across the world, or tune a guitar, or find out the weather, or find out the score in the Jays game, all at the same time. It's amazing that technology has provided us with that. So if we have to say that we have to choose between God and these amazing feats of science, I just say I don't want that have to make that kind of decision. But I do know that it does get controversial at times, and so I'm not here simply to win or to convert Matt or to convert everybody. I'm simply here to join in the discussion, and I hope to add something to it tonight. I believe as a Christian that the Bible encourages scientific discovery. According to Matt and other popular atheists in their work, science has pushed away thousands of gods, and atheism is simply going one God further. I would argue that it was the Bible that was the first one to brush aside the idea that there were thousands of gods out there. The Bible said that all other gods were false gods. They did not create the world. There was only one God, and He made the world. So there was a question then, should I worship the sun? And these were what the questions that the ancients asked. Or should I study the sun? Christianity would say you should study the sun and worship the God who made it. Again, that complementary nature of science and faith. Science can give those who do good science a sense of awe, and then with a source to say, thank you, God, for making this. So science and faith do work well together, or science and Christianity, rather, I should probably say. there should be no proposition without presupposition, and you've likely already figured out that I will argue from the Christian perspective. Or when I talk about God, that's who I'm talking about. John Polkinghorne from the University of Oxford, the 21st century physicist, said in his book, Theology in the Context of Science, we have this, the quote back there, he says, "Our universe is beautiful. It is constantly rewarding scientists with the experience of wonder and the marvelous order which is revealed through the labors of their research." That was Polkinghorne's experience as a top-level scientist, but it's also the experience of great minds throughout history like Copernicus, Galileo, Pascal, Boyle, Kepler, Linnaeus, Newton, Edison, Mendel, Pasteur, Kelvin, the list goes on. These are all giants in the history of science who are also committed theists. A book that was recently published called 100 Years of the Nobel Prize. It was published in 2005. It chronicles the winners of Nobel Prize from 1900 to 2000. And it notes that Christians, be they Catholic, Protestant, or Eastern Orthodox, have earned 65.4% of all Nobel Prizes. That number jumps up to 72.5% in the discipline of chemistry. Elaine Howard Eklund recently published a book called Science versus Religion: What Scientists Really Think. From 2005 to 2008, Eklund randomly surveyed 1,700 scientists from 21 elite U.S. universities. She found that nearly 50% of them had strong religious convictions. For the other 50%, when she asked them, what was it that caused you to ditch or to reject religion or any kind of belief in God? And she found out very strikingly that it is not the science that led them to disbelieve God. In fact, it's probably the same answer from these high-level scientists at these U.S. universities that maybe many of us would give as well. It's things like, I had a bad experience with the church, or I don't like Christians. I have moral objections to the God of the Bible. I have some serious problems with certain issues. But it's not science necessarily that leads them away from it, according to Eklund's research. If the contrary to what I'm arguing for, if science actually leads us away from God, then we would expect that the higher someone rose in the scientific world, the more they would become atheistic. And I have just argued that that is not the case today or throughout history. Now I'll give a few affirmations of some things in science that I believe give us evidence for God. Some would demand proof. Say, prove that God exists. I cannot do that. I cannot give you mathematical certainty that God exists. What I can give is evidence or some clues that God is indeed there and that God is responsible for the world that we made. In the 1920s, Edwin Hubble made a telescope and then looked out into it and saw a red shift. He saw that the light was actually going outwards. That's hence the red. And he realized that the universe is expanding. And a universe at the rate of expansion could not, he concluded, have gone on forever. Had Hubble joined with a bunch of other cosmologists, Georges Lemaitre and others. They eventually got Einstein on board, and Stephen Hawking concludes their research with this line. He said, all the evidence seems to indicate that the universe has not existed forever, but that it had a beginning some 14 billion years ago. And then Hawking calls this probably the most remarkable discovery of modern cosmology. So what has science taught us? Science has taught us that the universe has not existed forever, as confirmed by Stephen Hawking, one of the most gifted minds in science. This term was ridiculed, or so this idea was ridiculed at first by a man named Fred Hoyle, who told the media that, Hubble and his buddies are always talking about that Big Bang, as if it was a term of derision in the scientific community. And certainly it was controversial at the time, but now Hawking says this is accepted amongst scientists today. So it was once termed to make fun of Christians for the reason that it smelled a little too much of what the Bible would call the beginning. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It was not always the case that people believed that there was a beginning to the universe. We used to adopt the steady state universe theory all the way back to the time of Aristotle. But now, research will point us to that point where the universe began. In 2003, three very famous cosmologists, Alvin Board, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, were able to prove a theorem which shows that any universe at all, which is in a state of cosmic expansion, on average throughout its history, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary or beginning of its existence. And that applies, according to the Bohr, Guth, and Vilenkin theorem, that it's not just this universe, but multi-universes as well. Should there exist multiple universes, they could not have had an eternal past, according to their research. Vilenkin pulls no punches when he says that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what can convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. So we have to ask the question then, what caused that beginning? We are talking about the beginning of material. I would argue that it must be an immaterial being. We're talking about the beginning of time. I believe that it must be a timeless being that had done it. We're talking about the beginning of everything, all material. It has to be some kind of spiritual being to create it. Or at least I would argue that that's where the evidence leads us. And of course, we can discuss that point further later. Second clue that I believe is good evidence for God is the fine-tuning of the universe to support life. Astrophysicist Paul Davies wrote in the International Journal of Astrobiology, he says, there is now broad agreement that amongst physicists and cosmologists that the universe is in several respects finely tuned for life. Elsewhere in his work, he says the impression of design is overwhelming. Freeman Dyson, one of the foremost theoretical physicists, concluded along the same lines as Davies. He says, the more I examine the universe and study the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe, in some sense, knew that we were coming. What they are talking about is the fundamental constants that are necessary for life to exist. I can list just a few of them, but my time is limited, and so we can't go into all the detail that perhaps we would need to fully flesh this out. Consider the force of gravity. At the moment of the beginning of our universe, the Big Bang, what we call it, gravity had to be just right. If gravity is any stronger, then everything that came into existence would collapse on itself and there would be no universe. If gravity was just a touch weaker, everything would fly away from each other and there would be no cohesion of any of the material. Consider the nuclear strong force as well as gravity. This nuclear strong force is what we credit for holding a nucleus together. Science has discovered that if the strong force, were 2% weaker, protons and neutrons could not stick together. It would give us a universe of only hydrogen atoms because it has no neutrons and just one proton. If the strong force were just 0.3% stronger, protons and neutrons would stick together with such force that only heavy neutrons would exist. There would be no hydrogen, and you cannot have a universe with only hydrogen or without hydrogen at all. Other factors would include the nuclear weak force, the electromagnetic force constant, the cosmic expansion rate or the low entropy rate. And just on a very practical level, because we're getting a little too into the clouds or even further than that into space, the low entropy rate we can appreciate because a bad haircut won't last us, a whole year. Or we don't have to cut our grass every day or once a year. We can actually, this world seems fine-tuned to support life on Earth on a very small level, practical in our lives, but on a cosmic level as well. And I think we all have to make a decision at that point. Was it chance that did it, or was there a design behind it? So what are the chances? Well, it depends on what you're willing to bet on. I checked Vegas today, and the odds of the Edmonton Oilers winning the Stanley Cup this year are 35-1. If you're a Calgary fan, it's a little better for you, 30-1. I perhaps am the least confident in my team, the Vancouver Canucks. I looked at the odds today, 100-1 are our chances of winning the Stanley Cup. Now, I love my team and I support my team, but I'm putting no money on the Vancouver Canucks this year to win the Stanley Cup. 100-1 odds is far too weak for me. We may bet on them in our hearts, but we should not do well to put any money on them. Well, if that's the odds of our team or my team winning, what about one chance in 1 part in 10 raised to the 10th power raised to the 123rd power? This was the calculation of Roger Penrose of Oxford University as he notes the probability of the initial low entropy conditions of our universe being obtained by chance alone. His conclusion was, it sure seems like this universe is fine-tuned. That is my conclusion as well, as we say that this is a good piece of evidence that the fine-tuning or design of the universe necessitates a designer, that chance just simply won't do it. Well, finding evidence for God is not simply about just playing the chances. It's also about detecting agency. Is there evidence for an agent who is involved in this world? In the 1986 book, The Blind Watchmaker, Professor Richard Dawkins from Oxford University defined biology as the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And so I want to say that there is the appearance of design is not just the appearance, but actually is there because it was designed. I have a computer programmer at my church. Matt actually told me this before. He used to deal with computer software. So he would know that if you're going to have a computer program, you need to have a complex system of codes there. Richard Dawkins has noted this very code in every single cell. He said the machine code of genes is uncannily computer-like. This is not an analogy to computers, but an inference to the best explanation, and that's why I call it evidence for God. Who better to appreciate the complexity of the DNA than the man who writes code, or at least he did a lot in the beginning? Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, wrote in his book, The Road Ahead, he said, human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. And then I guess Steve Jobs came along and one-upped him on that, but that's a matter for another debate, perhaps. But here's my point. We see code in computer, and we conclude that it would be an insult to tell the computer programmer that all of that came about by random chance and mutation. We would say this is not just a product of time and chance leading to the conclusion that the program was made. And so if we see design in that kind, if we see agency in code, I'm going to say, could we not conclude that it's a good way to now look for agency in other things, and we find it in DNA? Richard Dawkins acknowledges that there is more information in DNA than in 30 volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica. And I would ask the question, is that not good evidence that there is somebody writing that code, and is God not a good example for who that could be? Intelligent design is the only known cause of large amounts of information of functionally specified digital information. I'm running out of time, but I want to commend you to the works of others who will go deeper in this topic. The works of guys like Stephen Meyer, or Cambridge-trained, he was a Cambridge-trained philosopher of science, or the work of William Dembski. This evening I am arguing, and I'm pleased to be here to join the discussion that science points us towards God. To build a case, I gave the following points. Well, first I started with an introduction that it doesn't seem like the higher you get in science, the more God gets pushed away. And then I said that I see evidence for God in the beginning of the universe. If there was a bang, then bangs need bangers. I want to ask the question, who banged that first bang? And God seems to be a good piece of evidence, or at least to explain what happened. And then I see fine-tuning in the universe. And before we get into anything biological, we have to make sense of why is there life permitting universe at all? Was it chance, or was it finely tuned because God did it? Thirdly, I looked at information in DNA and said, we know that in our world, when we program something and we put it together, it becomes a program. And if we tweak that at all, it breaks down. With the DNA, I see plenty of information. I see secular scientists willing to say there's information in there, and I want to make the step and say there's information there because God put it in there. And so I'm looking forward to what Matt says in his opening comments, and I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. That was a wonderful talk. I wanted to get some humor to put into my little introductions here, but if you look up humor on science and religion, you're always going to get some humor that's bound to offend somebody. So I found one.
Perfect.
Did you hear about the atheist, the Jew, and the Catholic who walked into a bar? The bartender says, "Hey, is this a joke?" Anyway, for the opposition.
I thought it was funny.
For the opposition, we have Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty is an American public speaker, an avid gamer, a magician, an internet personality, and also he's lost his luggage today. And was the president of the atheist community of Austin from 2006 to 2013. He has hosted the Austin-based webcast and cable access television show The Atheist Experience since 2005. and formerly hosted the live internet radio show Non-Profits Radio. A Southern Baptist for more than 25 years, he sought to become a minister until his investigation of his own religious views led him to reject supernatural claims. He now identifies as a skeptic, humanist, and atheist. He is a founder and contributor of the Counter-Apologetics Encyclopedia Online, Iron Chariots, as well as the Atheist Debates Patreon. Is that Patreon?
Yep.
Project. Which are dedicated to providing the understanding and tools for more effective discussions between theists and atheists. He is regularly engaged in formal debates and travels the world speaking to secular organizations, churches, and university groups on religion, philosophy, skepticism, atheism, humanism, and magic. He's married to Beth Presswood, a microbiologist and winner of the Austin Chronicles listener-selected Best Podcast, Godless Bitches. They live in Austin, Texas. I didn't know how to say that. With 4 cats, 2 snakes, and the occasional scorpion. Please welcome Matt.
Man, who wrote that? Did I? I didn't write that. Somebody else put that together and I sent it to you, I guess. Holy cow, it sounds like I've done a lot of stuff. Maybe that's not the case. Hey everybody, thanks for having me, and sorry I don't have a suit. I know you didn't care about that, and what I'm wearing doesn't have any impact on what I'm going to say, but it does piss me off. And I've had an interesting evening trying to get a hold of anybody from United Airlines, and since this will be posted on YouTube, I'm going to say that United Airlines just completely hosed me, and everybody should know that. So, once upon a time, thank you everybody for having me here. I appreciate the organizers and John and Guillermo for serving as timekeeper and referee, and I don't think we're going to come to blows or anything. And I did take a shower, so I don't need to mess with your bowl. I was also baptized 41 years ago, something like that. Probably don't need to do it again, but we'll see. That's good. So once upon a time, our ancestors tried to make sense of the world that they inhabited. Why did the wind blow? Where did everything come from? What was that sound? What's in that bush? Why is this hot? Why is that animal no longer moving? Why do I feel bad? Who farted? Some questions are easier to answer than others. For many of these questions, in the absence of good scientific methods of investigation, we relied on a number of intuitive, but ultimately fallacious methods for answering questions. In some cases, we accepted the word of the village elders. After all, they were more experienced, they usually had good information about pretty much everything else, and it made sense for us to listen to them. We were almost kind of programmed or evolved to listen to our elders. It makes sense because we are the species where our young can't just be set off into the world to fend for themselves from the beginning. Village elders, shaman, witch doctors, spirit talkers, and other purportedly wise individuals would explain that thunder was the sign of an angry or perhaps happy god or being who lived in the sky, and that lightning bolts were tossed by Thor or somebody. The world, this thing's... I know, it's terrible. Don't touch. So the world was filled at that time with spirits, gods, and other magical explanations. Along with the more independent supernatural proposals, we began to see collections of supernatural proposed explanations, and they are combined into either a pantheon of many gods or eventually into perhaps one supreme being with many subordinate supernatural beings. And as we began to learn more about the world, we learned better ways to investigate. Brave individuals explored the world, cataloged information, and looked for better explanations than the one they had already been giving. They looked for better explanations for the phenomena they witnessed, and they developed more rigorous ways to go about that investigation. They would occasionally put their lives at risk in pursuit of a better understanding of the world than they had been previously offered. And at some undefined point, this developed into a tool set that we now generally refer to as science. Now, there is no one true scientific method. I know many of us were taught, oh, the scientific method is you make an observation, you form a hypothesis, you go out and test it, you try to get independent verification, you try to falsify it, falsification is a big deal, and then you submit it for peer review, and bam, it's a theory. It's not really the way science works. There's different methods for different sciences because they're studying different things. Science also doesn't make absolute proclamations about truth, capital T or lowercase t. It just tries to build models that describe reality as best as possible. These models are tentative and probabilistic, and they're subject to revision upon new information. In other words, the exact opposite of dogma. Good scientists try to follow the evidence wherever it leads. They don't begin with a, here's what happened, let me go prove it, and try to massage the evidence to fit. If they're doing it right, they may have some ideas that may pan out and other ideas that may not pan out. But if the data show that this is the case, even if that's not what they were expecting, then that becomes the tentative conclusion. That becomes the area that we begin to investigate further, because science doesn't just stop. It doesn't say, yep, we've got the answer to life, the universe, and everything. We're done now. Let's try and fix philosophy. So when the prominent religions held that the earth was the center of the universe, that their God created everything, including life, and that their God somehow sustained this universe in order to maintain a natural order, what did they offer to back up those assertions? Nothing. We're not even sure how the stories got started. In many cases, we can kind of guess about how the stories got started. We're kind of tweaked to see agency. We are, if the bushes rustle and you, hey, what's that? You're more likely to get eaten than the person who runs away suspecting that there's agency even when there's not. And your offspring are therefore more likely to see that as well. But that's not the only reason. There are natural, intuitive leaps that we make to agency as a matter of inference, because we live by inference and induction. Today is similar to yesterday. This event is similar to this other event. Therefore, it's likely that this event has a similar cause. And since I know Joe Bob is the one who hit me over the head, when that thing fell on my head and I couldn't find it anywhere, there must be some agent out there who did it. And if I can't find a person or some sort of other animal, then maybe there's a spirit being. We are just not comfortable with not knowing. It's incredibly frustrating, and that's a good thing, because not knowing is what drives us to try to know. The problem is that as soon as you assert that you have the answer and that your answer can't be wrong and that your answer comes from on high, some unquestionable authority, you stop looking. Religious proclamations about truth retard progress. If we're looking at why does the universe exist, and I promise this isn't an early rebuttal, it just happens that John phrased it this way. He wanted to know who did the bang. I had somebody call the show once and they said, if God didn't create the universe, who did? Wait a minute. How did you determine it's a who question at all? What we should be saying is, what is the explanation for the origins of the universe? And if it turns out that the explanation is a God, woohoo, I was wrong, and so were a lot of other people. But we don't get to start by deciding that it needs to be a who, because we've already narrowed the focus and we need justification to narrow it. Some people weren't willing to accept the proposed explanations, and they set out to find out whether or not those answers were correct. Religious institutions famously struggled with scientific findings and still do. Galileo, who was referenced, was jailed for refusing to cant the idea that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Some religions continue to resist scientific findings related to evolution, climate change, vaccines, and some even require adherents to avoid life-saving medical procedures, a practice that's killed many people and many children whose parents buy into this horrible, dogmatic, anti-science instruction. In the entire history of the world, whenever religion has claimed a supernatural cause for a manifestation in reality, and we've been able to actually find out what the actual cause is, not once has it been a God or anything supernatural. Every time we've been able to find out what the cause is when it was asserted to be supernatural, if we're able to find out, it has not once been supernatural. Why is that? That's because the secret to this particular debate topic is that science cannot possibly confirm the existence of God. It cannot investigate the supernatural. Science operates on the foundation of methodological naturalism. It doesn't say the natural world is all there is and the supernatural is malarkey. It says, hey, we don't have any mechanism to investigate the supernatural. We can never, until somebody gives us a mechanism, confirm supernatural causation. So the best we could ever do is get to a point where we don't have a natural explanation, and then we have to say, hey, we don't have a natural explanation. That doesn't mean a supernatural explanation is warranted or justified. That is something that would need evidence supporting it. It doesn't do any good to say, oh, well, science doesn't know this, so God. Occasionally they'll try to claim that the findings of science changes, as if this were a problem of science, as if there's something wrong with updating your position with new evidence, an action that religions are strongly resistant to. That's actually one of the strengths of science, recognizing that every conclusion we reach should be tentative, because we're not gods and we're not apparently getting information from gods that we can verify. So Catholicism has been okay with evolution for quite a while, but other people consider it a fairy tale for grown-ups. These other people are part of the same tradition that believe in pretty much the same God, and yet they have different understandings and explanations about the natural world. And I get accused sometimes of only picking on Christianity on the show or only focusing on a particular doctrine on the show, and my response has always been, I'm not trying to paint you with a broad brush, I'm trying to paint this, and if you stand next to it and get paint on you, I warned you. I can't help it if different denominations have different views. And I don't know much about John's specific beliefs, but it's funny because on Tuesday night I did a debate and the arguments presented there were basically cosmic origins and fine-tuning again, so this seems to be the modern trend here, even though the topic of the debate was entirely different. So what evidence do they have when they say, hey, we're willing to accept evolution as Catholics would, but we think God had a hand in it? What evidence do they have for that? None. It's just what they believe. It's what they suspect may be the case because they see something that to them appears unlikely, and the best explanation for something that appears unlikely to them is God did it. This is essentially a God of the gaps type of argument. Gaps in our understanding of the universe. Anytime there's something we don't know, we seek to fill it, and we don't always fill it with the right answer, or we don't always have good reasons for sticking the answer in there. And as science goes about investigating the world and finding answers to things, it can't confirm the supernatural, which is why it hasn't. But when it finds natural explanations that used to be claimed to be supernatural, what do we hear? Oh, well, it's a natural explanation, but God still did it, somehow. Somehow we're going to shoehorn God into, he fiddled with DNA, or he fiddled with this, or, you know, when you went out and discovered that gold on the beach with your metal detector, it was God making the metal detector work. So trying to add God onto explanations as well as stick him in the gaps of explanations. Throughout history, scientific findings have consistently closed or narrowed those gaps, leaving less and less room for their gods. If anything could be argued as science moving us away from God, it is every single time we've been able to verify a cause, it has never turned out to be the God cause that somebody proposed. Now maybe all those other people got it wrong and the remaining gods got it right, but what are the odds of that? And everybody who believes in a God believes their God's the right one and all the other ones are the wrong ones. And so their God's the explanation for this. And it turns out that the gods that have survived are the ones that are a little more malleable, the ones that are more prone to interpretation. So what science do religionists, advocates of different religion, do to demonstrate the truth of the claims about their religion? None. And when I say they don't do any science, I'm aware that there are creationists and intelligent design proponents who might claim that they're doing science or even are doing science, but they've had to invent their own peer-reviewed journals. They've had yet to publish any significant findings that would actually confirm the supernatural, in part because they can't. They would first need to come up with a mechanism by which we can confirm supernatural causation, and that hasn't happened. As soon as they do, they have a new scientific discipline that all of us, including me, will jump all over. Because now we'll have the door open to investigate something else. And if it turns out that some people were right all the time, That doesn't mean they had good reason to be right, but okay, fine. I'm happy that now we're able to demonstrate it, because the time to believe it is after it's been demonstrated. The time to believe it is not just because we haven't been able to demonstrate an alternative. If science were moving us towards a God, we'd have believers consistently submitting their scientific findings which supported their views. And good scientists would have to accept those findings, because science thrives on new findings, especially when they open up with new areas of research or overturn the current accepted findings of science. Science that confirmed ways of verifying the supernatural would be front page news. It'd be in every journal. It would garner Nobel Prizes, and the Templeton Foundation could stop trying to rope scientists into investigating supernatural proposals that they can't possibly verify. We've tested prayer. We've tested intercessory prayer. Guess what? It works at a rate roughly about chance or less, which is exactly what you would expect if it didn't work. And there was an exception to this finding, and that is the people who knew they were being prayed for actually did worse in the study, as if they had performance anxiety, because now they know people are praying for them and it doesn't seem to be doing anything. And in fact, they're starting to get worse. What's the response to this? Mess with the table. Thou shalt not put the Lord thy God to the test. Well, if that's the case, why did we do the test in the first place? See, either God exists or it doesn't. If it doesn't, we're done. If it exists, it either manifests in reality in some detectable way or it doesn't. If it doesn't, we're done. Because the God that doesn't manifest in reality is indistinguishable from the God that doesn't exist from our perspective. He may exist, we have no way of confirming it. And every believer is running around claiming to be a little God detector, even if they think that God is undetectable, which means they're now claiming to detect the undetectable. This doesn't thwart them anyway, because they think that the undetectable that they're detecting is capable of making them a detector of the undetectable. And I'm not just being glib. When I was a believer, I thought my God was detectable. I saw God all over the place. God did this. Oh, God spoke to me. God moved me in this direction. Oh, it made my aunt better. We prayed and this happened, and I saw it. I felt it. And I was wrong. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying I didn't have a good reason to believe that it was to happen. I'm saying my conclusions were fallacious, and so are the conclusions from everybody I've ever heard talk about this. I'm not closed-minded to the idea that there's a God. I'm closed-minded to the methods that some would try to use to demonstrate a God. The methods of, well, we can't think of a better answer. Wow, this really seems improbable. I just feel it. That's not science. Science closes the gaps into which theists try to insert their gods. And it moves us away from those explanations and towards naturalistic explanations, because that is the limit of science. It can't demonstrate those supernatural explanations are false or true. Just that there's no need for them and no place for them. There's no clear gap in evolution that would allow for God to intervene. If you're mixing chemicals and you run across an anomaly, but you don't have any justification for claiming that God is somehow messing with your beakers and fiddling with your results. And when I talk about this to proponents of creationism, intelligent design, those people who believe that God does interact in the world, the mere suggestion that God would fiddle with somebody's experience, they dismiss. But that's what they're claiming he does all the time in many ways, and that they can detect it. And if you had to sit around and consider whether or not God was messing with your experiments while you're doing them, you'd make no progress. We wouldn't have gotten anywhere. The philosophical limits of science make it impossible for it to move us toward a God. If we found through those prayer studies, for example, that a lot of people had gotten better, what's the next step? All right? So we had a bunch of people utter some words or think some thoughts, and people got better. What's the next step? Let's go on and we'll investigate this further. Is it just these people? Is it a particular doctrine? Is it a particular church? Is it a particular utterance or a particular thought in a particular way on a particular day for a particular patient? And then if we got down to the point where these three people could utter or think something and everybody on this side of the room would get better, would we have confirmed God? No. We would have what appears to be a strong correlation that we might even be able to demonstrate or claim or reasonably conclude as a cause, but we don't know why what they do works. In order to find out why what they do works, we have to be able to investigate the proposed explanations, some of which, if we're going to say they're supernatural, need a mechanism by which we can investigate that at all. So what can we conclude? These three do something and this happens. We don't know why. For a lot of people it'd be enough. Whatever religion or doctrine, whatever vegetables they were eating, those would become our new mainstay. Maybe it's what they're eating. But for the people who say, this is enough and I've concluded that there is a God, and worse, that it's specifically my God. How did they conclude that this is the explanation, or that this is even possible as the explanation? Because the supernatural is beyond our ability to investigate. All we can investigate are manifestations in reality. And just because we don't have an answer doesn't mean we get to assert a supernatural one. These limits are the reason that it's impossible, not for God to exist. I don't know if a God exists or not. But it's impossible for science to move you toward that. And it consistently moves it away, because all of the times that we've asserted a supernatural explanation and been able to investigate it, it's never been able to be confirmed. And so you can believe and you can think you have good reasons, but you don't get to blame it on science. You can accept science and accept God if you want, except where those things come in conflict, and then you do have to make a decision whether you like it or not. And that decision's up to you. But that's time. Thanks.
That was perfectly timed.
Thank
To the second.
He's done this before.
I'll now give you each 15 minutes for rebuttal.
15 or 10?
I think 10, yeah.
I'll
10
take 15.
minutes,
It's 10 minutes each?
10 minutes
Yeah,
each. You
great.
want to vote again?
It's good. It's good. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Mr. Dillahunty. I thought, as you know, when you're in Canada debating, we probably should start with the points that we agree on. So I did write down a few of those. The first one would be that we encourage scientific research. We think science is great. We both agree that science is moving forward, that increasing in knowledge is a worthwhile endeavor, and that ignorance is to be avoided. We also agree that we need to be humble when doing science. That scientists have been wrong before. Simply because you have a lab coat and a degree does not mean that you get a free pass for omniscience. And I think for all of us, we as participants in this discussion, whether you're in the discussion yourself or if you're talking or listening, you have to have this humility about you that says, I could be wrong about what I believe. I could be dogmatically wrong, and we all have to have that. And that's something that I share with Matt as well. You see, I grew up in the church just like Matt, and I had my doubts. And it led me to a time of discovery, saying, what is it that I actually believe? I don't feel like I was brainwashed. I don't feel like anybody pressured me. I don't feel like there was an appeal to a collectivism or simply just listening to testimony. I really feel like there was a genuine research that led me to look at science and as a core, because we could trust our emotions, but I wouldn't really go with that. We could trust groupthink, but I wouldn't trust that. I would trust science. And so it was actually those points that I gave that led me to re-engage with the Christian message, that re-engaged my belief that God was there and have more confidence than I did before the doubts started to come in. So that in that part, we agree that we had doubts, but my story led to a different conclusion. So I just want to address some of the points that Matt brought up. The first one was this idea of the God of the gaps. He was asking that is science gaining and religion retreating? And I would say that is a very common misconception, that the more science learns, the less we need God. There was once a time when we needed God for this much, but now because science has pushed God, we only need Him for a little bit. And some of you, I know, would argue that we don't need God at all anymore. And I would just say that that's a false dichotomy. God is not retreating as science squeezes Him out of the picture. What I think is happening is God is a good explanation for what we find science discovering all the time. See, the Bible does not start by saying, in the beginning, God created the parts of the world that we do not know. No, it says that God created the heavens and the earth. That means everything. God made everything, the parts that we know and the parts that we have yet to discover. It's kind of like saying, well, the more I study the iPhone, the less I need to know about Steve Jobs. You see, I can understand all sorts of things about the iPhone, and therefore it's replaced my need to know its creator. I don't need to know about its designer because I've studied all the different apps, all the different functions, all the settings, all the hacks on a phone. What I would say is quite the opposite. The more I study the phone, the more I'm amazed at the genius of it. The more I think, I got to learn more about the guy that designed this. And so I'm curious about the book that Steve Jobs wrote, and I want to read it. And there's a movie coming out very shortly, and it's all about his life. I'm quite curious about that. What led to my curiosity? It was my knowledge of what he has made. The thing that came out of his mind was so fascinating to me that I wanted to know the mind more. To me, that's a good illustration about how we can actually be engaged in the pursuit of God through pursuing the world that God has made. And our curiosities should lead us to a point of saying, where did this all come from? You see, it would be a bit silly to think that the more I understand about the laws of aviation, and the more I understand about planes, and I could take apart the plane, the less I need to understand about Boeing. The more I understand about the universe, the more I want to appreciate the God who made it. It is not a God of the gaps. It is a God of the whole show, the God who made it all. And that's the experience of many Christians and how they view engaging with science. Matt did question my scientific basis for all of this, and I was a bit taken aback by that because I looked through my notes again and I found quotes of very high-level secular scientists, people that I thought we would all agree on that carried some weight. Paul Davies, Richard Dawkins, and the list went on. And I quoted some Christian scientists as well, but these were, I wasn't just making people up. These were people that I said, when we look at their research, what's the best conclusion to what they say? Now, they won't all come out and say God did it or whatever, but we want to use the inference to the best explanation. So given their statements that the universe seems to be fine-tuned and was waiting for us, fine-tuned for life, what's the best explanation for that? That it came about by chance, or that God actually fine-tuned it, that he knew we were coming? And that should any of those fine-tuning constants that I talked about, they're like a set of dials. Should any of them be tweaked, we wouldn't have any life at all. And I would say that the best explanation for fine-tuning means that there is a fine-tuner. And the best explanation for a beginning of the universe means that there is somebody that had to be there in the beginning to do it, and before the beginning. I would argue that this being, whatever it is, we don't want to give too many specifics quite yet, because all we can know is that if it created time, then it must be timeless. If it created material, it must be immaterial. And if it created at a certain time, we could maybe make a case that it is a personal being. Because a personal being has to make a decision to say, wait for it, okay, boom, let's create. And so the fact that it started at some time, we could make a case that there is a personal being behind this. That Aristotle's unmoved mover actually has a personality. And if we wanted to get into it, I could probably tell more about why I land that it's the Christian God, maybe in our conversation a little bit later. So I think that answers Matt's question of how do we know who did it? Well, based on some of the things that we know about the beginning, the origin of the universe, there are a few conclusions about the characteristics. As I said, it's timeless, immaterial, and personal, and I think God is a good explanation for that. Matt talked about mechanism and miracles, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit as well. He said, give me some methods, and then we'll understand if there's some supernatural activity out there. But all we have is natural. And I believe that's true. I'm not of the persuasion that angels are pushing the planets around. I believe that gravity is responsible for it, and we know that because we've studied gravity. Since we all agree that events generally happen in accordance with natural laws, so naturally things happen a certain way in accordance with the laws of physics, the laws of nature as we would call them, I would prefer naturalistic explanations every time over supernatural ones, all things being equal. It's quite different from assuming at the outset that all events must be explained in only naturalistic terms. It is a huge leap to say that usually naturalistic things happen to all naturalistic things happen. And I just want to ask the question, who has the authority to make that leap in this room? I would say this, we only have a very small sample size of experiences. My life is 34 years old. I don't know how old you are, but that's how long we have. And so to make a philosophical statement that all events are only based on natural causes is too far of a step that I am prepared to make at my age. A more open-minded, scholarly approach would be to hold that, if available, natural explanations may actually become implausible. And we should consider explanations that go beyond the known natural laws that describe how the world generally operates. It takes one way of doing science and applies it to a dogmatic statement about the whole universe. So I believe that we shouldn't just say God did it to everything. That we believe, as I've said before, God is responsible for natural explanations because God did everything. He was the one that wrote the laws of physics. He's the one that put the information in the DNA. That's not a surprise to you guys who've been listening to me. But to say that it never happens, to say that miracles never happen, is too big of a stretch to say. And I would say that the more we study the laws, the natural laws, the more we understand the patterns, and then when some pattern is different or something happens, we can say, whoa, this isn't how things usually happen. Maybe there's some kind of supernatural agency involved. Answers to Prayer could be one of them. I would recommend the work of Craig Keener. He's wrote a 2-volume, 1,000-page book called Miracles, which he took a scholarly approach to various case studies that were brought before him and concluded, well, I won't give it away, you can buy it on Amazon, but that miracles are possible, I'll say that. So I would just say, believers are often accused of being very narrow-minded, but I would just say, isn't the person who says that no miracle ever is possible and writes miracles off completely off the bat a priori before even considering what might have happened, isn't that more narrow-minded than the person who says, usually I believe natural causes, but I'm not naive to think that God, who could intervene in this world if he so chooses, could actively work. And I would believe that one big miracle for Christians would be the resurrection of Jesus. Would that not be a great time for God to say, I give the stamp of approval on this guy, therefore I will raise him from the dead. Dead people usually stay dead. And it was such a miracle that God was obviously making some kind of statement by raising Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. Those are my 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Does that sound like Fred Flintstone? Anybody else? Like, it's not that I don't trust you. I just always want to stopwatch right here where I can see it too, because otherwise I'll talk all day. Not that you'd let me. So tons of notes, not sure how much I'll be able to get to. First of all, I didn't say miracles were impossible. I didn't say that everything was necessarily natural. As a matter of fact, I said the exact opposite. I said that science has a methodological limit, that because it can't investigate and confirm the supernatural, that it does not consider those. Science, and me, as I pointed out earlier, would be happy to accept claims about miracles, claims about the supernatural, just as soon as somebody actually demonstrates a way that we can investigate them. Something beyond, I don't have a better explanation. Something beyond, man, this really seems improbable. Something beyond, I have a book. There was this issue about, that God isn't needed anymore. Well, I'm not concerned about whether something is needed or wanted or desired. I want to understand reality. I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. I don't want to just try to find out that my preconceptions are correct. So this is a side note which doesn't really pertain to this debate, but I have to do it anyway. This idea that the Bible was the forerunner of getting rid of the other gods, saying that there was just one God. That's kind of a modern view of some parts of the Bible. You might want to look into the henotheistic ideas of the Jews, where those early passages were, hey, these other gods are real. I'm just your God, and I'm the supreme God, which is why Pharaoh's magicians could do the same tricks as Moses, right? Just Moses' God could do it better. But that changed. And the nature of Christianity changed. Actually, that time was Judaism, not Christianity. And that's cool that something like that can change. But why did it change? I don't know. I can't tell you about the origins of it because I don't have a time machine. What I do know is that it didn't get any better with regard to science, with regard to the evidence for things. The big arguments that he presented, I mean, apart from citing Hawking, who's an atheist, Dawkins, who's an atheist, and Guth, who's an atheist, I mean, they said these things about how the universe looks, but that seems to be cherry-picking quotes from them, because they understand that this is the way the universe works, this is the way the universe appears, and then they go on to offer the reasons why they don't think supernatural agency is a useful explanation. So it's neat that we can point to all these atheist scientists and say, wow, the universe is wonderful and magnificent, and this is unbelievable. This is the odds against this are incredible. And yet they understand that until you demonstrate that the odds of this occurring are less credible than the odds for God, you can't say that the God is a better answer. And you can't calculate the odds for God. You can point to all the factors, fine-tuning you want about how unlikely this particular universe is or this particular version is. By the way, the fine-tuning arguments are biased towards us, as is every other argument. Our arrogance knows no bounds. This universe was created for me. How unlikely is that? What if we tweaked those things and some other life had arisen? Maybe it would be similarly arrogant and think that the universe was created for them. Plus, we haven't demonstrated that any other universe is possible. And even if it's incredibly unlikely, you have to know how likely or unlikely your God explanation is. When you're trying to figure out between a number of different possible conclusions which one is most probable, if there's one you can calculate and one you can't, the one you can't gets disregarded. It doesn't become more likely by default. Hawking has also said that if the universe is fine-tuned for anything, it's fine-tuned for the creation of black holes. I love the idea that the universe is fine-tuned for life just because it can generate life, when the bulk of the planet that we live on is hazardous to us, no matter how special we might think we are. And so far as we can tell so far, only this tiny little portion of our planet in one solar system, in one galaxy of billions of billions of billions of billions, even allows for life. How unlikely is that God would create an entire universe and put us on this one itty-bitty planet? What's the rest of it for? He's like Wile E. Coyote. He's going to construct the world's biggest, the universe full of galaxies with all of this wasted space that we can never know anything about, yet we're the thing that's special. Oh, those things that we thought were stars forever, which were created on the fourth day after light, according to Genesis, so that conflicts with the finding of science. Those things that we thought were stars, those are galaxies. That opened our mind. When Carl Sagan talked about the demon-haunted world and science as a candle in the dark, this is what he's talking about. We look around and we see and we presume that there are demons and angels, and I know he said he doesn't think angels move things, but these supernatural elements are our explanations until somebody lights the candle. Until we figure out that that little dot in the sky isn't just another sun, it's another galaxy full of suns, full of planets, and what's going on there? There's an interesting science finding that's been making the rounds on Facebook, and I thought I'd mention this. Science has proved that God didn't create the universe. These guys got together and combined a couple of scientific ideas, inflation and I want to say double secret relativity, but that's not right, because that's like double secret probation. But anyway, the point that I'm making is don't rely on the headline for the information, because headlines are there to sell papers. And don't just think that just because somebody uses a word, nothing, that it means the same thing that you understand. What else did we go through? Nobel Prizes, 65%. 65% of Nobel Prize winners believe in God. Okay, how many of them got Nobel Prizes for demonstrating anything about God? 0. The fact that people believe in God is hardly relevant or surprising. The fact, when you go to like the National Academy of Sciences, they, by every study I've ever seen, are less likely to believe in a God and less likely to believe in a personal God. And the more you know about science in the modern era, the less likely you are to buy into fundamentalist dogma, the less likely you are to buy into the ideas about personal God. That doesn't mean that they're all that way. There are plenty of scientists, brilliant people, who believe. And one of the things we know is that brilliant people are good at rationalizing why they believe things that they came to believe for not brilliant reasons. And we also know that all those brilliant people like Dawkins and Hawking and others, they could be wrong. And they'll be the first ones to tell you that. But the way we find out they're wrong is by doing more science. The only thing that proves science wrong is more science. Religion doesn't prove science wrong. I already talked about the odds, but we need to talk about detecting agency and detecting design because that was brought up. He said that computer-like isn't an analogy. Yes, it is. The word like makes sure that it's an analogy. Computer-like, code-like. We are describing things in the best terms that we can. It's the same reason that I think we come up with and detect agency elsewhere and use God-like language, because we see things that appear to be like agency, so we go with it. If you come along a bunch of sticks blocking up a river, is it a bunch of sticks or is it an actual beaver dam? How do you tell the difference? Well, you have to investigate it, and you have to have something to compare it to. You have to know what a beaver dam looks like if it's made by a beaver, and what a bunch of sticks washed away during a flood look like, and you have to be able to compare the two. We don't recognize design by inferring agency just because it looks code-like or looks too complicated for our brains to conceive of it coming about naturally. We don't get to do that. We don't recognize design on the basis of complexity. We recognize design, intentional design, by contrasting it with that which occurs naturally. This is where you get to Paley's watchmaker. You're walking along a beach, you find a watch, obviously it was designed. The thing that you don't recognize is that the reason you know it was designed is because you already know about watches and you know watches are designed. What if you didn't know anything about watches? It would just be something that's different from something else. But in the idea where there's a God who created absolutely everything, you would be walking through a universe of watches on a beach of watches and picking up one watch and saying, yep, this proves my God. When you think your God made every grain of sand. When you think your God made every atom in the universe. When you think your God wrote a code into human beings. Maybe he signed it. Maybe we'll find that someday.
1 minute.
Oh, I already did the who, how do I know who? And yet it comes up again. Who created it? Who? They're like owls. I don't know who created the universe. I also don't know what the explanation for the origin of the universe is. I'm not a physicist, so I can't evaluate the ones that I've been hearing a lot about. And that's important, because we got to a lot of science stuff. And at the end of the day, what we're really hearing is, hey, there's a God, and he gave you a brain, and he stuck you in a world where scientific investigation leads to the most reliable information possible. But if you want to be justified in believing in God, you have to become expert in these sciences, these dead languages, and then make inferences that aren't consistent with the best scientific principles for what could be the single most important issue of all. None of it makes sense. There's not a God model that makes sense. And the God hypothesis cannot serve as an explanation for anything. It has no explanatory power. It's trying to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery.
I'm just going to interject for 1 second. When you came in, you were given cards. We will be taking
Can we take like
questions
1 minute to use the
on
restroom?
down the aisles while they're maybe doing conversations and pick them up. So
It'll be on camera, so. Oh, I'll wait.
You can go.
Nah, it's all right.
Relax. We got time.
I'm recording, it's fine.
I think we'll now have 15 minutes of open conversation between the two debaters, and I would ask each of them to be as polite as possible. And to
As what?
Polite.
Oh,
Okay.
We're in Canada. We do polite.
So I'll pass the mic over to Matt.
Thanks. How you doing?
Very good, thank you. Yes, polite as possible. I heard that this is how we think about it in Canada. There was apparently a Toronto radio station that wanted to be like the Americans. They have American is apple pie or American is baseball, and Canadians couldn't agree because hockey's not our main sport. It's our second sport, and we couldn't.
Is the first one curling?
No, it's lacrosse.
Because I love curling, so that would be awesome. But
So anyway, so they were debating it, and they didn't want to offend each other, so they decided that it would be as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. So that's why our debates are polite. So anyway, I don't even know where we should go. I think can I just talk about one of your points? I guess. Sure. I think the one thing that I think is interesting that. Given the size of the universe and our response to that, so it would seem quite arrogant to say, all this was simply fine-tuned for me. I think it's just depending on your view of reality. If there is a God, then you could say, one way to look at it would be to say, wow, when I consider how big everything is, Like, God, who am I that you are mindful of me? The psalmist in Psalm 8 says that, right? So we know that simply size itself does not determine worth, right? Because a lump of coal is much more or less valuable than a diamond, and a diamond is much smaller. So we could say, wow, this God is so big, he made all of this. And from a theistic perspective, I would just say, that's amazing that he would care about me and even have a relationship with me. And I think an atheist wouldn't make that decision. They'd say, well, we are simply just one speck. Or I was even listening to a Bill Nye acceptance speech. He won Humanitarian of the Year just recently, and he basically said, we are just this small speck, and the conclusion is, I suck. And I was like, oh, that's kind of sad. But I think that he was just borrowing from his worldview. Would you espouse that? Or what do you think?
I can't speak for Bill. He's a funny guy, and he could have been being a bit sarcastic. I get the
he definitely was. I mean, he was funny. He was making a joke.
One of the things that atheists are tired of hearing is that life must have no meaning or purpose if you don't believe in a God.
Right.
And actually, Chris Johnson has a film and a book about it, and I've done a number of talks. But on this idea that, you could certainly look at the universe and say, wow, look how much God loved me to create all this stuff. The thing is, the things on the other side of the universe don't affect us at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they could affect us. And they create a sense of awe and wow and humility under, wow, this universe is so big.
Right, but why would you assume? So my questions here, how do you tell the difference between, hey, this was all created for awe and humility, and hey, this is just the way things are, and we're looking at it and inferring awe and humility without justification?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would just be a disposition of your heart where you were at with that, or I mean, probably borrowing from your worldview, right? If you have a knowledge, like, or a pre-knowledge before you look in the heavens and say, I believe there's a God, then you could say, as the psalmist in Psalm 19 said, the heavens declare the glory of God. So they show me how big he is.
Yeah,
but if you don't have that worldview, you would look at it and say, the heavens don't declare the glory of God. So is it not your commitment you have before you look, whereas an atheist and a theist would look to some data like how big the universe is from a totally different...
The commitment that you have before you look is called a bias or a prejudice.
Yeah.
It's not actually evidence for the proposition.
Right.
So science's thing is to say, okay, let me look at it and try to remove as much bias as possible. So even theistic scientists can say, let me look at the universe without my bias that God created it for me and see if I can confirm this.
Right.
And what it sounds like you're saying is that, if you go into this believing this, you're going to think that. And I completely agree. What I'm wanting to know is, outside of starting by believing, how can we justify belief?
Right.
And because I'm not saying you're saying this necessarily, but I've heard this from others. Oh, that you have to begin by believing. No. What couldn't you justify that way? If I begin by believing that the Hindu scriptures are right, I'm going to find things there. They think that the universe is 13 billion years old or so, and it's easy to interpret that they got the age of the universe much more closely to correct than Christianity or Judaism or
Right.
Islam. So if you begin by assuming that this is the way things are, of course you're going to see that. I want to know, absent that beginning presupposition, how can we confirm what you suspect versus what somebody else suspects?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it's part of, for me personally, like as I mentioned in my second part, it's part of a cumulative case that made me want to stay as a Christian. And so basically it started with, laws of abduction or abductive reasoning, which says, what's the best explanation for the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning, and then I would throw in other ones that you've talked about ad nauseum, so I didn't even bring it up. The moral argument, right? You're probably so sick of debating that one.
Oh yeah, I'll buy you a dinner for not mentioning the moral argument.
You're welcome.
We could do that another time,
Yeah.
but it just throws the rest of this off, and we have a whole other debate
and it's
about
not
that.
in our topic, so that's good. But I would say it's all part of a cumulative case that then says, it leads to the point of, well, what is this God like? And I admit that me as a human, I don't have the ability to just make all sorts of abstractions about God, because I want to know what is God like. And that's where, as a Christian, I believe the best thing is that God came to us and said what he is like. So Jesus actually talks, and if you want to know what God is like, here's what it's like. If you want to know how he wants us to behave with each other, here's what he wants. And then ultimately when he dies on the cross for us and then rises again, that's the place where I say, if that's true, if that really happened, like usually, that's why I said, usually people die. And so naturalistically, we know that. But there is this one event where people for 2,000 years have been talking about this actually happened. It made me really look at the resurrection and say, okay, what's the evidence for that? And if that's true, then that God that got me all the way to believing there's some kind of being out there who started everything, fine-tuned everything, it's probably this guy. Because this resurrection is a very big deal to Christians. Right?
And I get that. And if there is a God, I'd like to know as much about him as possible too. It's just that I don't think we've established the first question or a method for finding out the second. If we come to, for example, trying to use the Bible, I don't have any way to verify that. When you talk about the resurrection, I'd love to have a debate on the resurrection. Every time I try to have a debate on anything about the Bible or the resurrection, it gets canceled, changed, and we get back to this vague, does God exist in a deistic sense? When I was a Christian, my obligation under 1 Peter 3:15 was to give the reason for the faith that I had. My God was evident, my God was real, and even though I don't think I had good arguments, I was at least,
Right.
I thought at the time they were good. And I was convinced, as Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict is a wonderful book for convincing people who already believe. For the people who don't believe, they poke it full of holes.
Yeah.
And one of the big holes is I don't have any way to investigate this, but even if we, and I know this isn't the topic of the debate, but even if I were to grant that somebody named Jesus existed and that we have a somewhat accurate record of some of his words and deeds, even if we knew that there were people who were reporting a resurrection, I still can't confirm that it happened or why it happened. And if I was convinced that somebody rose from the dead, I don't know how you can come to say that this is the best explanation when there's no demonstration that that explanation is even possible. Because we're talking about, we talked about the origins of the universe, for example, the Kalam cosmological argument, which you gave a modified version of.
I didn't want to get all philosophy.
Good, because I just did this Tuesday with Blake, and man, he was really philosophy-minded. And I liked the conversation. But if the cosmological argument doesn't get you to a God exists, it just gets you to there must be a cause. And from there you infer things about the cause. And even if I were to grant that something was the cause, the only inferences that I could reasonably grant are that it's something capable of this, which makes it a tautology. I don't have any reason to think that it was an agent, that it was a thinking being who acted with purpose. And even if it did, I don't have any reason to think that it still exists or sustains or is your particular God, because Muslims use that argument and everybody, I realize it's another Abrahamic God. I don't know how we get from this position of we'd like to know what happened to, hey, there's a story about somebody rising from the dead, and by golly, it sure seems like this particular version of a God, which is represented in the same books, is the best explanation for that.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that kind of circular to say that this happened in my book, and my book tells why it happens, and that seems like the best explanation for why it happened?
Yeah, I'm actually first sad that you haven't got a chance to debate the resurrection, because I think there's a lot of cool stuff out there. I took a class on it, done a lot of work with a guy by the name of Gary Habermas. He's done some stuff that looks at a minimal facts approach, and what it does is it takes the Bible and says, we're not going to say the Bible is authoritative. We're just going to say the Bible is a book in history. And I don't want to take up all the time because we got to get to the questions that you guys wrote down. But if you have time, you can look up Gary Habermas, Mike Licona. They did some work on basically just saying, we're just going to look at the pure history. And there's a few minimal facts that we can put in there, namely that there was a man named Jesus. I mean, that's from a scholar perspective, other than some fringe internet people, not a lot debate that Jesus was a real person. There was some guy named Jesus, that he was crucified. And Habermas has said, the far right and the far left both agree that this man Jesus was crucified, that he died, and his disciples were sad. And then his disciples had some encounter that they thought were encounters with the risen Jesus. Now secular scholars would say, maybe they're wrong. They were wrong, or maybe they were misguided, or maybe this or that. But anyways, they went. The change is noted by both secular and Christian scholars, and even some Jewish scholars. And then the last point is that this guy named Paul had this experience that he believed was an encounter with Jesus. So there was a historical figure named Paul. He wrote a couple of the books. and he had what he believed was an encounter. And the interesting thing is what Habermas and Lacona do is that they start plugging in all the different theories, which we don't have time, which would be a great debate topic,
Sure.
though.
Karen will set it up in Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They plug in all these different theories, and they say the best explanation is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, a lot of people would say, but that sounds like a miracle, and that's why I said, how do we know that miracles don't happen unless we're writing them off right away?
But again, I'm not saying miracles don't happen. I'm saying we haven't had a confirmed
But there probably
miracle.
is a lot. You're far more open-minded than a lot of people I've talked to on that area. They say it's only naturalistic explanations.
How many atheists are with me on that? Because this
Okay.
is something that comes up all the time about how close-minded it is. Oh, miracles can't happen, and I agree there are some there. And I'm glad you brought up Paul, because I know that now we're kind of far afield about science moving us towards or away from God, and I'll just take that as a win. But sorry, there's no. But
They're still not baptized yet, so I guess I haven't got anywhere.
I might stick a finger in there. So Paul has this experience, or that's what's reported. I don't know. Why isn't a Damascus Road experience good enough for all of us? Why is God playing favorites with Paul and the rest of us have to become experts in dead language and have debates for thousands of years with arguments that just keep getting repolished off and represented and rebutted?
Why does Paul get that experience? I mean, you have to, if you believe in God, then you have to believe that God gave that experience to Paul because he needed it for the propagation of Christianity throughout the world. I mean,
But
miracles
wouldn't
aren't happening all the time, right? They're not ours to demand, they're God's to give.
Hey, look, if there's a God, he can do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that if there's a God, if the claim is that there's a God who wants a relationship with people,
Right.
and he's willing to give some people these experiences, which are evidently rock solid confirmation, and the rest of us are left to flounder around and seek God honestly, and then be told that when it doesn't happen, either God didn't want to, or you had sin in your life you didn't try, or no. I don't understand why, if God seeks a relationship with everybody, he can't just reveal it. Because to me, this boils down to, I've got a girlfriend, you don't know her, she goes to another school.
Yeah, I've met people like that before. That's why I brought my wife with me to travel today. People didn't believe me for a while. And honestly, Matt, I can't answer that question unless I'm God, other than my personal doubts have been along those lines. And what I've learned as a Christian now for many years is that I've learned to trust the things that God has revealed when I don't see the things that are, when the doubts start to cloud me. So personally, I look to Jesus and I say, is Jesus the kind of person that can be trusted? I've obviously, laid out my cards saying I believe that he's God. I believe that he's alive, that we can have a relationship, and it is difficult. I mean, there are unanswered prayers in my life. I'm a pastor, and I have questions.
So when you say we can have a relationship, though, what do you mean by relationship? Because
it's a relationship unlike any other relationship. I totally grant that. But it's with God, right? So it's different.
Okay, but if it's a relationship unlike any other relationship, what's the justification for putting the relationship label on there? I'm just asking, what do you mean? Because I thought I had a relationship. I now understand that I didn't. I don't believe anybody else does, because when I ask them, what does it mean to have this relationship, I get, it's a relationship not like any other.
Right.
What does it do?
At least it's consistent, right? Obviously we're reading from the same blog, whoever these other guys that you're talking to. But I would just say it's complex. I believe that God nudges us. I believe that he does show up circumstantially. And ultimately for me, I know that because my emotions will throw me back and forth, I have the arguments that I presented tonight, but also the testimony of the Bible. And some won't grant that the Bible is God's word. That's just not my personal experience. Having read the Bible for a long time, I just have concluded that this book knows, it understands me, it understands the world, and it's my hope that one day through this relationship with God, I will live forever with him in eternity. And that's maybe just my Christian bias. It's definitely my Christian presupposition, and that's what carries me through in those times when I think, having a relationship with God is different than any other person, and so that's where I kind of land.
Oh, we only have 2 mics. I'll yell.
No,
I'll pass the mic back to you. I have a lot of really good questions, and it was really hard for me to just sit here because I took philosophy of religion when I was a graduate student, so it's really hard for me to sit here without a mic, without saying, yeah, but. So the first question is for Matt. Question: if God didn't create humans with fine-tuning, what did create humans with fine-tuning?
So I'm glad it's a what, not a who, in the question. So yeah, first of all, the absence of an explanation doesn't mean the God explanation wins by default. If we had no explanation for the origin of human beings or life or the diversity of life, that doesn't mean we get to say that God is a better explanation. There's no demonstration that it's true or possibly true. Now, on the issue of fine-tuning, depending on how you want to phrase it, I'm happy to agree that the universe is fine-tuned, as long as you don't include a bunch of baggage in there to say that it was fine-tuned by somebody or something or some intent. Really, all we mean is that we live in the universe that produced us. It's not that the universe was fine-tuned for life, it's that this is the life that was fine-tuned out of the universe that could produce it. And when you want the explanation, I'm not sure if you're asking for the origin of humans, the origin of life, or the diversity of life. We don't have an answer to the origin of life, the field of abiogenesis. There are some ideas. There are a number of experiments that show that the basic building blocks of life can arise from non-living material under the right circumstances. We don't have a time machine, so we can't verify that. So we keep searching, and maybe we'll find, as it seems to be likely, based on some new information, that the universe is teeming with either the building blocks of life or the potential for the building blocks of life in different areas. We don't know. And so when people ask me questions like this, I say, go study the science, talk to the actual experts, not the jackass from Texas who just likes to talk and doesn't actually do science. But also, please get comfortable, as difficult as it is, with saying, I don't know. When people ask me about, what would you teach kids? Or what do you do when kids come to you with questions that you don't know the answer to? I don't just say, tell them I don't know. Say, I don't know, but let's see if we can go find out, because that instills a sense of discovery and inquiry in them. And also it doesn't preclude the option that we could find out. And if you try and you don't get to an answer, that doesn't mean that you just get to make one up or accept one that somebody else gave you that they can't demonstrate.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Because I'm just curious. So you do this a lot, like obviously debating, and I've heard you give that answer before. I'm just curious, off the record, and you can say no, this is too personal, but do you, like, in your pursuit of I don't know, do you say, well, but I'm still interested in pursuing? Or, like, because I know I don't know is okay, I say it all the time, and it doesn't follow that the answer's not there, it just means that I don't know what it is. But how are you pursuing the answer to the person who asked that question of, how did it all start? Or are you just happy with saying, I don't know?
Sure. He was asking me a question. I didn't know if I... Sorry.
I don't want to get
You could have mine if you want. Oh.
So this is a great question. There are some things that... There's so many things that we don't know. And for some things that we don't know, I'm happy to continue pursuing it alongside everybody else. I'm happy to follow other people in the pursuit of those things if I don't have a relevant expertise. But there are other things which, the mere nature of those things, we need to find out 10 or 15 other things before pursuing this is even possible. So those get set on the shelf. I did a series of debates in Church of Christ, and the main preacher came up to me at the end and asked me, are you comfortable going to your deathbed not knowing these things? No. But I'm less comfortable accepting answers without good reasons.
Right.
Because that would keep me from finding out the answers. So I'm not running around actively pursuing every unknown answer, but I'm keen to follow the research of others, to help out where I can, and non-God grant me the wisdom to know the difference.
It sounds like United Airlines kept you busy enough today doing other things. So.
I'm not pursuing anything to do with luggage.
Yeah, that's a noble pursuit.
You mentioned the design of the universe, so one question that came in, I've lost the card now, I have so many cards.
You did.
Was, why does God let bad things happen? For example, a baby is burned to death in a burning building. Why does God intervene to stop that? You spoke about the magnificent design of the universe.
Totally.
Some parts of it don't look so well designed, like, say, Saskatchewan.
Oh boy. Let's just say this, Matt. I was driving through Saskatchewan. Actually, I served my time at seminary there in Saskatchewan. But I was actually driving in through Saskatchewan, and it was the coldest day in winter, in January, and there was a prison there, and they had these huge gates around the prison, and I just thought, who would ever want to leave the heat in that prison to go outside in the gates in Saskatchewan? It's so cold. Anyway, on to the question. That is one that I have dealt with, and probably one of the biggest deal breakers in my experience as a pastor. So I'm not just doing Christian apologetics, but I'm also a pastor by day. That's my day job. And that's the one that I've wrestled with as I've watched people come to me saying it's cancer, friends that have dealt with miscarriages, and my own struggles that we all deal with, because this is a broken world and we're all in it. And so I've had to make peace with this somehow. And then again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I go to Jesus and I say, this world is broken, and a lot of it is us doing, right? We're the ones who invented the bombs. We're the ones who go to the school shootings. And I see that God has given us a measure of free will to make decisions. He wants us to love, but we can also hate. He wants us to be courageous, but we can also be cowardice. God has given us this measure of free will, and yet through it all, he is telling some story that, though it involves difficulty, it involves ultimate triumph with his death, dying for the problems that you and I do, and sinners, and so he pays the price, and then he rises again and says, I'll grant eternal life. You can come with me in a place where there's no more pain, and no more tears, and no more cancer, and no more bullying. And if you want to follow me, then this is the kind of place that I have prepared for you. And as a Christian, that is my hope. My hope is in the resurrection of Jesus, that he will make all things right one day. And my prayer is, Lord, come soon, because this place is so broken and messed up, and I see it on a daily basis. I don't just say that to you to make an emotional appeal. This, to me, is the foundation of who I am as a Christian. It's rooted in Jesus, and in a painful world, he took the pain on himself. And that's the thing I love about Jesus, right? He's not just some God far away just saying, oh, you guys are all messed up. He actually is God with his hands dirty and his heart broken. And he's in there in the pain, and he's dealing with evil in such a way that he says evil's going to have to be paid for one day. So,
Getting his hands dirty doing what?
Sorry?
Getting his hands dirty doing what?
I would say...
I understand this idea of dealing with evil. If you're the most powerful being in the universe and you want to deal with evil, it's dealt with.
I would just say through his death on the cross, right? That's how we Christians believe that Jesus achieved a way that all of us, because we could say, oh, these evil people are far worse. But the truth is, the evil that's inside of them is the same evil inside of me, if I'm honest.
But the people aren't complaining about evil in that sense. The problem with evil is about unnecessary evil, unnecessary suffering. We didn't create cancer or tsunamis.
Yep.
We didn't do any of this. You want to talk about man doing harm to man? Yeah, I'm with you, right, all the way. And I even buy into, no reason to go down the free will track, but at least this is what these people are doing. There's no reason to put it on God.
Mm-hmm.
What I've heard from other apologists, so I can't really saddle you with it, is that, all the things that are wrong, including tsunamis and cancer, are because we sin.
Right.
But if that's the case, then you have a God who presumably knew what was going to happen, did it anyway.
Yeah.
And then punished people for doing something wrong before they could even know it was wrong.
Yep.
And to say that someday he's going to get rid of evil, and someday he's going to make everything better, and someday some of us, whoever he happens to choose, are going to go off to a wonderful life, doesn't do anything to address the issue at all.
Mm-hmm.
And what's worse than that, because I've already said I'm not a big fan of the problem of evil, I prefer divine hiddenness, because there are responses. But on the problem of evil and this idea, my big thing is, it doesn't make sense. And if there's a God, whenever I bring that up, it's like, well, what God does doesn't need to make sense to you. It does if he wants me to accept that he's doing something good or that he has a plan.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, if you're a computer programmer and the little sims you program can't understand what you're saying, and you punish them for not understanding what you're saying, you're insane because you made them incapable of understanding this. Mm-hmm. And so we end up arguing about a God who's intentionally putting up roadblocks to the relationship that he wants in the world that he wants when he could get rid of all of it. He could fast forward to the end of time.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important that we understand when I'm talking about God, I'm talking about Christianity, because that's the only one I'll defend. But Jesus himself becomes a sim and then lives with the Sims, and then speaks the Sims language so they can understand, and then they get to make the choice, right?
He specifically spoke
It's a poor analogy, of course. I mean,
he specifically said he spoke in parables so they would understand, and then ironically he explained it so that they would. When he was a Sim, was he just as confused as all the rest of us? Because that's what it sounds like.
yeah. I mean, I get where you're going, Matt, and I understand. I think back to I think the strongest question you asked was about natural evils and stuff, and that is a big question. I think God, as a Christian, I believe that God is overall, and so He's sovereign, which means He has some kind of plan, which means that I don't have to understand the whole plan. And I think it's a huge leap in logic to say, this seems meaningless, this event, this catastrophe, it seems meaningless, to then say it is meaningless, right? So I think my perspective doesn't allow me to say all these bad things that are happening have zero purpose. When I could say in my own life the tough things that have happened, circumstantially or whatever, I've seen some kind of plan through it, and I know other people that say this difficulty was the best thing that could have happened to me, and it could be a tragic thing, or it could be just something as getting cut from a hockey team or something like that. But I know that it works both ways, and as a Christian, we don't have to decide, we don't have to be God's judges to say this was bad and this was not. We can say, God, you have a plan in this, and so I see that I can trust you based on what I know of who you are already.
And, wow. This gets back to something I've said before. You're beginning with the idea that God is good in order to judge things that don't appear to be good, right down to in the Bible when it endorses slavery, God must have had some good reason for that because it's good. If God's good and He endorses slavery, even if we think slavery is wrong, God wrote His word in His heart, and that's how we know He's good. My big question is, how did you figure out that God is the good one and Satan is the evil one? If it's based on what they wrote in your heart, if I wrote my moral code on your heart, you would judge me good no matter whether what I did was good or not. And if Satan had written his moral code in your heart, you'd judge him good no matter what he did or not. So how is this not just a big thing of circular reasoning where I begin with God is good, and when I see something that I attribute to God that I don't think is good, I just go ahead and say, yeah, it doesn't look good to me, but I trust you that it's good anyway. I mean, nothing about that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I'd rather start with a blank slate like we did tonight and just say, is there some kind of explanation for the phenomenon that we see, be it the beginning of the universe, design, and then I concluded that there is some kind of God. So then I see Jesus and He claims to be God, and I want to say, what's He like then? And I see Him taking care of the poor, and I see Him teaching us to love our enemies, and I see Him teaching us not to worry, to trust God, and I see Him then dying a sinner's death, or a criminal's death, I should say, for people that He claims to love. And as He's dying for them, He's asking the Father to forgive them. And I look and I say, this is, if I'm just observing this man, I say, He is good. He is laying down His life. I mean, we're going to celebrate Veterans or Memorial Day, as we call it here, and we're going to celebrate the act of these men and women who bravely laid down their life to pursue freedom for others. And that's when I look at Jesus and I say, this guy is good, and He also claims to be God. So I think I've answered your question from a non-presuppositional view and just saying, I think I see that this guy is good. I think Matt wants to, he's allowed to comment.
I've got an existential question for Matt.
Oh.
There's a recent accident west of town where the farm family lost 3 daughters in a terrible accident on their farm. How does a person survive and carry on if you don't have hope in heaven? How do you survive this if you don't believe in God? And another question was, what do you tell someone who's dying? That's, I think, a tricky question.
Yeah, you can
Sure. And I hate to do this right before the question because it's going to be glib, but there's no way to avoid it. On Memorial Day, we celebrate people who gave up more than a weekend. They're still dead.
Right. Fair enough.
So, the other reason I hate doing that is because this is a legitimately serious and difficult question. And to the extent that the question related to a real incident, I presume my heart goes out to that family. I have kids, I can't imagine what it would be like to lose them. The question of how do you go on without the hope of a reunion in an afterlife? I hate to tell you, I'm getting ready to do a debate in November on whether or not there's a soul. and I'm on record as saying that the idea of a soul and an afterlife is the most obviously dead proposition in all of theology because of what we know about identity in the brain. Life isn't hopeless. The idea of an afterlife may or may not be. You can hope for it all you want. But when you recognize that as far as you can tell, this is the one and only experience, only one and only opportunity I'm going to have to interact with people, you also begin to recognize that you don't have a good reason to think that there's an afterlife. And that what religions have done in an effort to provide people hope in terrible situations like that is actually poisoned them. They've actually set up a paradigm that encourages people not to treat people right the first time, not to cherish the moments that you have in this life, because they're made. If you think that when you're dead, you're done, you're going to value the interactions with people more, because you know you're not going to get to make up with it. You know, like that fight that you had with your parents, oh, I'll fix that tomorrow, and when it doesn't get fixed, you feel bad about it, and religions say, don't worry, you'll be able to take care of it, everything will be fine and right when you're in paradise. If you don't have that notion, you work harder to fix that stuff now. And it makes it painful, and it's not easy to lose people. But telling people, oh, don't worry about your bills, you're going to inherit $1 billion in 3 years, isn't honest. Telling people not to value the relationships you have here, that this entire existence is like dirty rags, it's a place to wipe your feet before you get to the real reality, is just as bad. If you thought you were going to inherit $1 billion, how would you live your life? You'd make a lot of bad decisions. We need to do a better job, and this is something the humanist community has been striving for, at teaching people how to deal with death. That so far as we can tell, right now, we're not immortal. If it turns out I'm dead and then there's a life afterwards, bonus. But I don't have any evidence for that. If I live my life based on it, I won't actually be disappointed based on my model because I won't know. But if we teach people how to deal with death better, how to deal with the relationships that they have now, we can change the way people go through a grieving process because their recognition of what's happening is that it's natural, it's not their fault, they lived the best life that they could, they cherish that individual, that person will live on in a metaphoric sense in their memory, and they had an impact on the world, and that's all any of us are going to get, and hoping for more just brings sorrow.
You know, it's interesting that Matt said that he was trained to be a pastor, or training to be a pastor. You make a very good pastor, Matt.
Thanks.
People were asking about me, what kind of atheist is Matt Dillahunty? Is he the mean kind, or, you know, like the kind you see on TV? I was like, no, he's the nice kind. Even though you've lost your luggage, you still, you know, I just appreciate your words to your community, and I think, that it was interesting. The one thing that I mean, that's the difference in our worldview, right? Like, I believe in an afterlife and you don't. So you're going to make the most of the time you have here. And I'm going to say that our time here is just a catalyst for what happens later. So, I mean, that's where the disconnect will be in terms of, you know, you believe that and I believe this. I just thought the interesting thing that I thought I heard you say before, when you were making a glib statement, was you said Jesus was only dead for a weekend. So does that mean that you concede the resurrection of Jesus? In which case, you know, I have this bowl here. When people concede the resurrection, this is what they...
So I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of a reducto ad absurdum.
Right.
I don't accept the resurrection of Jesus, but you do.
Right.
And so you equated what I consider to be, at best, even under your model, you know, if somebody came to me right now and said, hey, we will beat you and torture you and whip you and rip you to shreds and hang you up, and kill you, and it will end world hunger, but you have to stay dead, I'd do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not looking to be a martyr. I think that most people would do it. Holy crap, I can end a massive problem. If they did it, if they came to me and said, and oh, by the way, after 3 days you get to be God, hell yeah. I understand. I was a Christian for 25 years. I'm not saying this to insult or offend people. I'm just pointing out that when I look at this, I don't see sacrifice. I see a story that doesn't make sense about a being who created the universe and the rules of the universe, taking on human form, to sacrifice himself to himself, to serve as a loophole for rules that he made over the course of a weekend. And I don't see that much has changed or come of it, other than that there are a lot of people who believe that it made their lives better. But there's a lot of people who believe a lot of things made their lives better, and that doesn't make those things true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the disconnect would be then in the nature of sin, because we don't just believe that Jesus was being violently killed physically, but there was also a spiritual dynamic that he was bearing my sin, my ugliness, my pride, my failure to love my wife properly, my failure to love people, my negative thoughts, and also others who have committed terrible things. And that's the nature of grace. And so that's what was happening there at that time. And I would understand that if people didn't believe in the nature of sin, then they wouldn't understand just how horrific the cross is, and how amazing it is to a Christian to think that God would take my sin in my place. And that's all. I mean, I believe that's hardwired into the very nature of the universe, is this idea of substitutionary, someone paying for something for the sake of another, right? We have, in hockey, I don't know if there's any hockey fans here. I was a goalie for 20 years, and whenever I would make a penalty or something, I would hit a guy or trip a guy, often on purpose, knowing exactly what I was doing. What would happen was a guy would from the team, my team, would serve the penalty for me so that I could stay in the game. I mean, this is hardwired right into the rules of hockey. This is why I believe hockey is God's game, because we have a perfect example of a substitutionary act. Someone else is taking a penalty they did not incur upon themselves so that another could stay in the game. And that's what I believe is the beauty of the cross. So it's not just a physical thing, it's actually somebody paying for my sin on the cross.
I find that it's God's game, considering the overwhelming violence and fighting.
Yeah. That's funny. I know where you're going on that. I don't think we have time to go into Old Testament ethics during our time, but I know that's one of your favorite topics. And
Listen, I have one question of my own. Matt, you mentioned prayer. You made it sound as though, the only kind of prayer is intercessionary prayer. But people don't pray just for $1 million or to have their cancer cured. They also pray as a way to get connection with their deepest and highest values. True? And maybe that's the value of religion, that gives people a deeper sense of connection with themselves, and also a community with whom they have something in common.
it's definitely part of it.
I have two questions for you.
I thought it was a question for Matt. You were going after him.
Well, I started with Matt.
Okay.
First, does that explain the popularity and the widespreadness of religion itself? Just the social need and the psychological need? And for Matt, do atheists miss something because we don't pray? Is prayer something, and a community something that's important to atheists?
Where's my water?
Guys.
I'll let Matt go.
So I only mentioned the intercessory prayer because that was their studying thing we did. I fully recognize that people pray for a lot of reasons. I laugh because in the United States of America,
Oh, there's mine. No, I was just getting water. I was going to
He
steal.
healed. Neville Murray O'Hare became the most hated woman in America, and the general consensus among ignorant, and I mean people who don't actually understand the information, Americans, although we're all ignorant Americans, not you guys. Canadian is awesome. So she was hated because she took prayer out of schools, but that's not what happened. She took mandatory government-led prayer out of schools. You can't take prayer out of schools. Every time a test hits the table, there's a whole lot of praying going on and nothing to worry about. Now, there's also this idea of, I'm going to say something that's going to shock John. Prayer works. You shocked?
I'm curious. Keep going. Yeah.
If you're trapped in a mine and you pray, you've just increased the likelihood that you're going to be rescued. Not because, or not necessarily because there's some deity out there who's going to intercede on your behalf, but because we know that prayer and meditation causes people to use less oxygen, which means you're going to be able to be trapped there longer, which gives the rescuers more time to get to. My contention is that since we know that's the case, anything that I'm in favor of anything we find good in any religion or otherwise, we should keep and get rid of the bad. If religion got rid of all this baggage, hell, we'd agree. But the idea that prayer seeks out something higher within yourself, that may be, but there's no supernatural element required to that. So are atheists missing out on something? I hear from atheists who do miss community exercises because churches have co-opted the social nature and exploited it for their own gain. And I don't mean that in we're going to control the world by it. I just mean this is what they do. We're social creatures that get along. We're going to do a potluck. And there's Sunday Oasis, Sunday Assembly, Oasis, a number of atheist communities that are building up to fill this gap into people who feel that they're missing something. Not all atheists do feel that. But to the extent that prayer or meditation is seeking out something higher than yourself, I have no problem with it, provided that it's seeking something real, and that one isn't assuming that this is coming from the supernatural. This idea of a revelation. Revelation is already a problem. David Hume pointed out that revelation is necessarily first person, and to everybody else it's hearsay. I have no way of verifying your revelation. You have no way of verifying mine. And by the way, if I get what I think is a revelation, I have no way of confirming that it was actually a revelation, and not just me assuming that something was that. And so, if somebody wants to pray or meditate or think, okay, I don't know what you're praying to, but to the extent that you might be praying for a way to better understand yourself, I don't know why we would call it praying, because I can sit down and think and be reflective. I can interact with others, and quite often I find that both of those exercises help me understand myself and others better. If I sit around and talk to myself, I don't talk out loud with myself all the time, but sometimes I do. And then I sit down and talk to somebody else, because I'm not the ultimate arbiter of reality or even what I understand about me. That's another monumentally arrogant thing. When we do a test, and I'll let you go right after this, right? We put people in an MRI, and we ask them, hey, what do you think about this? And a particular portion of the brain lights up. And they say, what do you think this other person thinks about this? And another separate part of the brain lights up. So we've identified portions of the brain that reference self and other. And then we ask them, what do you think God thinks about this? Which part of the brain do you think lights up? It's not the other, it's self, which is hardly surprising when there are many religions, over 1,000 denominations in all that identify as Christian, that disagree on every single point of doctrine. And I was a Southern Baptist for many years. I can tell you right now, given some of the arguments that took place in the church, that there's not a unified notion of God even on the first pew of the First Baptist Church of the town. That's not a conclusion that everybody's inventing their own God, but it seems to be the case that everybody's version of God agrees with them and doesn't have some other component. And I find that bizarre, because if a God were to exist, we would expect it to be the other way, that we would think of them as another, or maybe even a third part of the brain. This God module thing, you can just set that aside because that's not really a God module thing.
All right, so the question asked of me, thanks Matt, was about how would we phrase it? Is it something that the church kind of takes?
Social and psychological functions.
Yeah. Can that explain why religions become so popular? Yeah, I think I enjoy talking to people from social sciences. If any of you are in studying social sciences, it's very interesting. Psychology, sociology. One of the things that gets brought up to people is, Christians have this idea of they need to have an idea of purpose. They need to have kind of a father notion in their life, and so it doesn't happen to be a nice coincidence that God is a father. They project that onto God, and look, all their needs are met. Or they have this community need and they need to be social, and look, there's a thing called the church, and isn't that convenient? Or they need to pray, people need to slow down, and in a busy world they need to have times of meditation or reflection, and it just so happens you have a thing called prayer. Look, we've solved all of your basic needs through naturalistic means. And again, I would just say that's an example of the God of the gaps fallacy, whereas if we can explain why it's important, or if we can explain it naturally, then it's not important. I would just say, look, if you believe that God has hardwired human beings to have a relationship with him, then there would be an emptiness inside of them that would only be satisfied by God himself. They would have a yearning for God somewhere down there that would say, this can't be filled unless God fills it. God would put it there. And if he indeed wanted us to be relational beings in community with each other, then he would put a need for community inside of us, so much so that we would go seek out it. We would seek accountability with each other. We would seek to encourage each other. We could help each other move a couch when it's needed. We could have times of worship together. And it just so happens that he has given us the church. And we've all seen how crazy our lives get when our schedules get too filled and we're just running like nuts, and we just need to slow down and reflect on what is truly important. And we feel like we need a connection with something other than simply just the material. Well, it just so happens that God has provided a way for that through prayer. So rather than seeing these needs, these basic human needs, as a way to disprove God, I see them as perfect evidence that God has hardwired the human being for relationship with him, relationship with each other, and I think that breaks down when we miss any of those three. So that's why I think religion would be so important.
And I agree, kind of.
Yeah.
So the one quick point is that if somebody were arguing that this is a disproof of God, they're wrong. My issue is not that, isn't it convenient that people have these needs in the church and God there? Because the thing you have to ask yourself when you're comparing potential hypothetical explanations is, what would the case be were the other thing to be true? So if there's a God who's instilled in people this idea that they need, communion with him and cooperation with each other, this is what we expect to see. And if it were the case that people naturally needed these things without a God, this is also what we would expect to see. So it's not just proof of God. It's pointing out that the hypothesis that this is because God cannot be demonstrated to be the correct answer, that we're torn between them. And so we have no way to tell the difference between the two.
Right.
They look, the invisible and the non-existent look the same to us.
Yeah.
The problem is that is a damning problem for the proposition that there is a God who wants this relationship, because there should be some mechanism to tell the difference. Mm-hmm. And the only mechanisms that we hear about that I hear about are that, God will reveal it to you, which we already know is problematic.
Back to science and hockey as well. I don't know if any of you saw this story in the news the other day. That scientists have finally found the genes that code for violence, so they're optimistic that they'll soon have a cure for hockey.
Cure for
Do we have
hockey.
time for one more question? Okay. I think it's really good. I think this conversation is really good. So one question is to both of you. What makes your belief or lack of belief reasonable and rational?
So mine, I used to believe, and I realized I didn't have a good reason for it. And the foundational reason for that was, I'm an atheist because I'm a skeptic. I'm an atheist, I'm a humanist because I care about human beings, but I'm a skeptic because the application of critical thinking to evidence is consistently the single most demonstrably reliable pathway to an accurate understanding of reality. The big issue for me is the burden of proof. It needs to be applied correctly. Now, on Tuesday night, in another debate, I had somebody say that theism is the default and atheism has the burden of proof, which is a fundamental mischaracterization of the null hypothesis, which cannot be disproved. It's part of the definition of the null hypothesis. So, you either God exists or it doesn't. Either manifests in reality or it doesn't. If we're talking about a God that manifests in reality in some detectable way, now we're probably talking about the God that believe in, or at least claim to believe in. And so there are two options. Either you begin by believing every proposition until it's proved false, or you begin by believing none of them, sorry, I'm going to put that finger up, until it's proved true, until there's then some demonstrated reliability. It's demonstrated to be reasonable to accept it. And if you go with the first one, then you have to believe all of the various gods that people have proposed, except for the ones that have been defined so narrowly that we can't in fact disprove them. Some of them have. Some of them have internal contradictions. I think many versions of Christianity actually do, but we have to have another debate for that. So you're stuck. You have to believe in everything that hasn't been disproved, which puts you in the position of accepting as true mutually exclusive contradictory propositions. That's called cognitive dissonance. And what it does is every belief you hold potentially affects every other belief you're going to hold, because beliefs don't live in a vacuum. They're based on ways of thinking, and they inform ways of thinking. And so if you put yourself in this confused status where you're believing mutually exclusive things, you're going to make bad decisions in other areas. Instead, if you say, I'm not going to believe any of those, I'm not going to assert that they're false, I'm just not going to accept any of those until they meet their burden of proof, now you've solved that problem. Properly establishing the burden of proof is why I'm an atheist, and an atheist in the sense of I do not believe that God exists. I am not convinced that religions have met their burden of proof. In a courtroom scenario, you don't vote between guilty and innocent in the civilized world. You vote between guilty and not guilty. Not guilty is a presumption of innocence, but it's not a declaration of innocence. Theists are claiming God exists. Christians are claiming that Christian God exists. I find those gods not guilty of existing. The burden of proof simply hasn't been established. If it ever becomes established, then I'll believe. This isn't about being closed-minded. This is about being a reasonable juror, not making a declaration that God's innocent of existence, but that I am not yet convinced of its guilt, and that people who are have not made a compelling case. This just seems improbable unless he did it. It must have been the butler. All the evidence is consistent with the butler doing it. The question they didn't ask is the evidence also consistent with the maid doing it, Joe Bob doing it, and somebody else you don't know doing it? Because if that's the case, what you're demonstrating is you don't have a good reason to reach the conclusion you have.
Matt, can I follow up with that? I'm sure you get asked like a lot. Let him keep it. Yeah. I just wonder, you must have been asked this a lot too, about what would it take for you to believe in God, and how do you answer that one?
Sure, I used to give glib answers about writing in the sky and language and stuff, and they're, it's sufficiently advanced in technologies indistinguishable from magic. It would be arrogant of me to presume that I could tell you what would change my mind. So my answer is, I don't know what would change my mind. But if there's a God, that God should definitely know exactly what it would take to change my mind, and should be capable of doing that, and has not done it, which means that God either doesn't exist or doesn't want me to know he exists. Either way, not my problem.
Yeah, so I think we should put this question, which is personal, in the context of the whole night, right? This is not, I'll give a bit of my testimony, because the question is why I believe, why I've chosen to, but it's not based simply on, I don't want you to see that Christianity is rational based on just because I said so, but based on the evidence that I presented. So lastly, at the very end of the night now, I will share that I'm probably prone to Christianity at first, as the first look, because I was raised in the church. I was raised in a Christian home. But as with many of my friends, and even with Matt, that is not enough to sustain us into our 20s and our 30s. So though Christianity got the first shot at it, and I realized that Jesus died for my sins, and at a young age I committed myself to him and through high school, but then again went through that time of doubts when it wasn't simply enough to say, well, my parents taught me this, or the church taught me this, or the Bible says this. I wanted to know the evidence, some of that stuff I've presented today. But today I believe that what holds me as a Christian, I believe in the goodness of God and the power of God, but I believe that Christianity is the most rational way of looking at the world the way it is. And I don't mean that as an offense to you atheists. Obviously you have your reasons for embracing atheism. But when I when I consider Christian theism and what it means to the world and how there is a beginning that has a purpose and that there's an end, which means that somewhere where we are at in the middle, maybe at the end, I don't know, I'm not an end times theorist or anything, wherever we are on that spectrum, I know that God has a plan for my life today, and that helps through very difficult times. I also know that it provides me a foundation for topics like morality or questions of human ethics and stuff, and I think that the biblical-based Christianity provides us a very clear reason to say that human beings are sacred and should be protected. And I also believe that Christianity helps me understand things like the sciences, or the fact that you can have a relationship with God and that He would be there for you in difficult times, and we could go on about those different times in my life when I believe He's been there. So I believe that though I was raised in a Christian home, what has sustained me is the comprehensiveness of the Bible. And we could talk about all the different various theories about biblical contradictions and stuff, but I believe that the Bible is a trustworthy document, and it has helped me significantly through very turbulent times and helps me understand the world. So that's what has shaped me, and why I'm very keen to take up opportunities like this to go and articulate my faith to you guys, so you can hear a little bit of the Christian worldview. Oh. Good question.
What would change your mind?
That's a great question. Pardon? It was a great, yeah, it's a great question because it was my question. No, I'm not that proud. What would change my mind is if they found the body of Jesus. If all of a sudden it could be given with perfect proof that Jesus' tomb was full, that He was not the risen Son of God, that would change everything. In fact, that's a biblical idea. Paul says if Jesus is not raised, we are to be the most pitied of all men. And so it would be the Jesus Christ. If he was proven dead and gone, and his tomb, He was still there in the tomb, I would not be a Christian today.
Can you thank both our panels?
Church in Red Deer here. They have brought in Jon for us. They sponsored bringing him in. And I just wanted to I'm not sure everyone understands that this was Jon's first formal debate, so he has done a fantastic
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.